Okay, it's 10 o'clock. Good morning, everyone. Today's session. When months ago discussed possibility of opening this session, I had no idea that as of 3 days ago, there would be a announcement by the Alberta government concerning carbon capture and storage tenure. And so the time when it works out like this, we have 70 registrants for today. This session is recorded. In terms of today's speakers, it's the only these founders of the CEO Energy Services Group, a unique energy law firm that combines both legal and non-legal services to help in this area. We provide services to companies interested in developing technologies and foreign technologies in the energy transition space. And carbon capture and storage is one of the core technologies that the Alberta government is depending on to reduce the level of GHG emissions in the province. They work on domestic and international projects that respond to national standards, spanning the petroleum, carbon capture and storage, helium, lithium, and hydrogen industries. He has 26 years of international and agricultural experience on projects in dozens. They live in Central Asia, Europe, Spanish, Italian, and Russian. His international and agricultural experience complements project companies among energy lawyers. And again, carbon capture and storage is not only had government, numerous governments around the world recently. Practice a geologist by training with over 40 years of subsurface business development experience. Prior to the CEO, he established Pat Housen's international business development efforts approximately 8 years. That was raised in Peru and posted to Cairo for 10 years. So, with that in mind, we'll turn it over to
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, that will come up here and sort of the dynamic duo in CCS, but really about CCS, actually, not a very happy. Yeah, that is CCS going for you. And that sort of one into subsurface optimized and that's a still exciting role. And that's really we've got subsurface inputs and subsurface outputs, and then the balancing act. we don't. Yes. So we're going to do today, we're going to discuss what CCS is. We're going to review different types of CCS opportunities, big and small. I think there's a tendency to understand CCS when we see it, which is usually we're going to dive into commercial and legal issues. And after that, we're going to do a bit of predictive analytics because we think CCS is going to be quite important to industrial development in the future.
Being here on Saturday morning and you this is quite a timely topic in terms of development globally. I mean, I know this is supposed to be a topic that focuses primarily Canada, in particular Alberta. But driving up here, I thought just globally. I first this industry is how fortunate we are here in Alberta to have a series of factors makes carbon capture so much easier in Alberta than it is to most of the world. Most of the world is in a state of, I would say, mild shock at the moment. Whilst I see Alberta getting on. And that's not just a raw and raising flag campaign. It really is founded on observation and a huge amount of global expertise around us. For those of you that I know this is a small group, not loyal, so you all really the same belief that if you get involved, legal violence just to give you a view, basically the opposite of the hydrocarbon industry. Instead of extracting, we're basically taking a product, compressing it, and sequestering the subsurface in much the same, just the opposite direction. Now, what we do is we not target what's called saline formations, formations that don't have hydrocarbons in them, in other words, no oil, no gas. And in Alberta, you got loads of them. You got this very old formation called the Canberra Ordovician sandstone. What does it do? And it's saline. It's under about somewhere. Yeah. If you think of this across southern and central Alberta, it's like a blessing from the heavens, because most parts of the world don't have that on their doorstep. That is like, it start off subsurface. What we do is just giving a diagrams, subsurface in 1, 2, we inject. You can inject this into coal seams, and we don't do that here. That's just, we do that in the likes of Australia, but we don't need that here. It's sufficient reservoirs in Alberta. And you can also use CO2 as we use, say, 60 years as an enhanced product to sweep out oil production. They're called enhanced oil recovery. CO2 has been used in North America. It started off in Texas in the late 19s, early 1970s, very far. So it's a well-known technology. This is not I don't know. This is known technology, which is great. And as I said, because of the maturity of a lot of the reservoirs in North America, One response roughly 10 years before I was born, and it blossomed in the 60s and 70s. So it's quite a mature industry as a result. Most of these reservoirs have been depleted and there's voidage, there are volumes. And that's a lot of the challenge, identifying the voidage, the available volume that you have, and the integrity of those structures. There's really, CO2, carbon dioxide sequestration. We think of it as three separate phases. They're both separate technically and cost-wise. Hello, good morning, have a seat. In terms of the carbon dioxide capture, probably the most expensive, challenging technical aspect, because the capture technology simply depends on the concentration of CO2 that you have. I'll give you an example. In this room, you've probably got, in terms of the atmosphere there, you've got oxygen, you've got nitrogen, but CO2 is probably way down the list. It's probably as a percentage of probably about 420, 450 ppm parts per million CO2. It's pretty low. That's 0.02% amount. Now, if we go to a power plant or a steel plant or any plant, any of these large emitters of CO2, their concentration coming out of the flue stack, the unpressurized flue stack, is probably in the range of 15 to 25% of CO2. So the differential between this room and that stack is about 500 to 600 fold. So that gives you an idea of the difference in concentration, and that's the challenge. Technical and chemical, this is basically all about chemical engineering. Chemical engineers have the challenge of having enough technology, in other words, the membranes and the filtration process to be able to extract those low percentages of CO2, concentrate them, and then compress them. Because that's the process we go through. Capture it through either a mechanical or a chemical process using amines or amine beds or a filtration process, and compress it. Like compression is pretty intense as well. That's very energy intensive. And when you say energy intensive, it's probably in terms, it probably accounts for about 50 to 60% of your operating costs when you're trying to compress that and run it at a factory. Many of the steel producers, many of the cement plants around the world operate realization. These very expensive plants and operate at very high cost. This is something important for the cost to this is the here also is not just I've got to compress, not this CO2, and I won't go into the thermodynamics of it because this is the chemical engineering 101. What you've got is you haven't got a gas, you haven't got a liquid, you've got someone in between, and it's called supercritical. This is the only bit of technical stuff I'll throw back here. It's a supercritical fluid. It behaves like a fluid, it behaves like a gas. It's highly compressed, but that's the state it serves. Very low temperatures, reasonably high pressures. You can then transport it and inject it. You know, inject it from permanent sequestration, or as I said before, you could use it to enhance your oil recovery. That's another issue. But you've got to transport it. You've got to take it from your facility, such as a power plant, and you've got to put it in a subsurface bed. Here in Alberta, we've got reservoirs right under our feet. here in Calgary, but the east, the north, to the north, east, central Alberta, you have these Canberra or Vision reservoirs, they're a couple of thousand meters. The only problem is you've got to get there's a horizontal distance, and that distance tends to be some of the major projects here, such as Crest and Happens. These super projects, ongoing since 2008, 2009. These projects require major pipeline investment. And as you know, pipeline is a serious contention issue. Building them, right of ways, public injections, and of course, cost. Pipeline is very take the podium and tell you woes that they go through, but those are the real challenges that the compression side. Actually, pumping it, getting it along the line is pretty easy. All you need is electrical pumps down and injecting it. The perforation side and the injection side is reasonably straightforward. Something as an industry has been doing for decades. This is probably the most simplified diagram I'm going to show you when it comes to costs. But we usually do it up without a little cost analysis on this one. The capture side I've shown here in the top left-hand corner in bog standard facility that makes either an ethanol plant, nitrogen production, ammonia production would be a good example with the bog CO2 production. We capture it, press the stage. Your compression facilities are right in the capture side there. They also have compression outside the gate, which is another novel concept that we before. You don't have to do all of it. Then we transport it to the transportation side of the lateral hole. Pipeline here. And calculations we need to verify depending the quality and the resistances. And then storage. Storage, at least I said here, is a pretty easy solution. I'll give you an example. I happened to be in a conference down in Houston in April, and there's a great conference on the I spoke to a data provider, a good fancy that I've used for decades, and they showed me some data on global ranges of costs. You may ask me, well, what is this costing per dollar? Because when I've been looking around, the cost range is the fully integrated cost is from $20 to $400 per ton of CO2. Or equivalent of ton of CO2 in the second example, but trust me, that's a huge range. And it's really no use to narrow these huge ranges so unpredictable. I started to speak to some colleagues down there, and they showed me that this varies tremendously, both regionally, pipeline lengths, volume that can be transported, and more importantly, it's that real estate statement. Location, location, location. For example, if you're in Qatar, at the top of the Gulf in the Middle East, the GCC, is a major gas producer. Their cost to take, for example, an ethanol plant, take the CO2 from it and compress it locally, minimal requirements of regulations, distance, 50 kilometer pipeline, somewhere in the region of about $80 per ton at most. If you then move to jurisdictions such as the southeast coast or the Gulf of Mexico, that same plant, because we're trying to test the robustness of the fiscal system or the fragility of the cost, that same plant is probably going to be about 160 to 180 US dollars per ton. And that's in a very robust market. Now, if you go to the dreaded dark hole, which is basically most of Europe, because most of Europe is frankly good, they got no subsurface reservoir worth damage. So if you go to, let's say, central Rhine Valley or somewhere in central Germany, that same plant is installed to transport it, and you'll probably need to transport it out of Germany, then by ship, and sequester it in the central North Sea, because that's an area station you got. Say, ultimately cost you about $260 to $280 per ton. So as you can see, there's a massive range where we need to fall. So what I'm showing you here, believe me, this is highly simplified, but we can certainly take it down to more specific examples of pathways, Quest here in Canada, and their numbers, depending how you calculate them, are running in the low hundreds, $120 to $180 per ton. That's a big generalization. Not all this data is transparent. This is a lot of influence and assumptions. By the way, just for the sake of continuity, we have don't say this is some of the summary of some of the techniques are injection zones. At the moment, even though you have a very bountiful resource here, those resources still have to be tested. You basically got to pilot each project for, in essence, integrity. Can you imagine taking a balloon, blowing it up, and just, it's not a dangerous gas, but a gas that, if dispersed, can cause a lot of harm to farmland, cattle, and individuals. You don't want that compressed gas to get out. So you have to have a good seal, good cap. So you have to have a robust assessment of the integrity prior to injection and monitoring. Huge monitoring, decades monitoring potential leakage. So even though you've got good reservoirs here, there's still not, there's a lot of effort in that. You have to analyze, and that's what a lot of subsurface here in Alberta are experts on. The only subsurface, that's exactly knowledge. So in that sense, tick that box for Alberta from an answer station. On the concept of novel locations for created equally, this is a question of distance. All the question horizontal and geographical distance from Britain, because these types are static. Can't move them around. The only thing that can move around with CO2 or particles and paramount, the airline industry contributes about 2.8% of all CO2 emissions. So they're really concerned. That's a significant amount. But we're not dealing with that. Those are difficult, hard measures. We're trying to deal with the low-hanging fruit CO2 emissions. So those, unfortunately, those are permanent structures for within 20 years and probably another 20 years. But the distance, they're lucky enough to be directly over a reservoir. When I say not all carbon emissions are created equally, food stacks produce all sorts of other rubbish. Nitrous oxides, coal farm plants, they're deadly. The stuff that comes out of them is just so bad. Not only is it difficult to capture, but the capture technology is prejudiced by some of these trace elements that are in it. So these chemical engineers have a real hard time trying to decarbonize certain industries. The easy industries, such as the refineries that produce ethanol, pure stream CO2, very, very little contaminants. Those are the low-hanging fruit that most of us are focusing on, how to get a big bang of capital costs for each phase varies tremendously. So just give an example. So no generalization you can make there. The operating costs are huge, and the capture side We spoke to, I don't know how many companies throughout the southern Mediterranean, cement companies, cement producers, and they are in a state of, well, as of a year ago, in a state shock, because they realized this is not a business. I didn't expect to have to deal with this. Not a subsurface company. No. Most of these see their products in jeopardy, their business in jeopardy. I mean, you can't underestimate the existential threat to many large entities in construction, steel, electricity, that feel totally picked upon, but certainly the future is very much in peril. So, on that note, we'll move on next. Sure.
So as we had mentioned at the start, as explained, CCS projects look pretty different, or have the potential to look pretty different. I think often we look at the pictures of pathways. That it's a very large inability to solve this. But it's actually interesting. It's not always the case. So actually, as Pat had mentioned, where did the idea of carbon injection come from? Well, it's an old idea. Yeah. When Pat said that even early in his career, they had started CO2 injection. But of course, EOR has been going on for a long time. There are lots of ways to do EOR. So CO2 is just one of them. You've heard of other things like water flood and miscible flooding, etc. So CO2 is just one way to do it. But there's one project in particular here that's sort of noteworthy, which is the Boundary Dam project. So that was the Sask Power basically captured CO2 and handed it over to the vapor the field operator, which is actually North Dakota. So there's a cross-border CO2 pipeline in North Dakota to help with oil production. So, yeah, so funnily enough, that's probably the the first peak example in Canada of waste construction. But of course, the purpose of the EOR projects, sequestering CO2, primarily it's actually to enhance oil. So, among those projects, there wasn't the same fact conserving monitoring the CO2 escapes. So that's where the industry began as a concept. And actually, Pat raised this question, which what is hub? Because you read about that in the newspaper. What is a CCS? Well, essentially, it's a centralized CO2 injection reservoir. In our parlance, we would say it serves more than one CO2 there. So we're going to get into the description between there. And frankly, a lot of it's new enough that, I'm not sure if you guys 10 experts would call these things. The words we use might actually be a little bit different. This is also new, it hasn't even been standardized yet. But a hub would give you the notion that you've got a centralized facility servicing CO2 emitters. So from that perspective, all CCS projects use hubs, except for something that we call single point storage project. So a single point storage. Here's one of them. So there would be, for example, a power plant that captures CO2 and then is sequestering its own volumes, no one else's volumes mixed in with that. And then we've got another term that we like to use, which is emitter first projects. So these are, we're going to get into this in more detail, but these are projects which are oriented towards a particular emitter. They may start off as a single point source project, but then you add third-party volumes from other emitters later. So we call them emitter first. We'll get into this because it's really there to service one particular emitter, class of emitters. So, you know, the big difference between what we would call CCS mega projects and an emitter first project is really frankly one scale. So how many CO2 emitters do you have access to the system? The length of the pipeline in the system is another factor. There are other factors, compression stations. Believe it or not, some of these things utilize maritime transportation. We'll get into that a bit as well. But it's, you know, the difference is scale, CapEx scale, geographic scale, volume scale. So coming to mega projects, you know, some of these names, frankly, one of the world's first. It was an experiment in 2010, 1.3 billion. I think the province of Alberta, it's about 700 million of that shall pay for capacity. So, you know, that's relatively scaled down cost. It's interesting about this looking at, I'm struggling last night to find CapEx values for Freeport, Acorn, and Teesside. And despite a lot of Google searching, you couldn't find it, which I think leads us to believe someone doesn't want you to know these things possible. Pathways, which you'll know is in Alberta. So that's the oil sands Pathways Partners. That's a $21 billion project. I do know from Freeport that the CapEx for Talos, which is just one partner, is going to be $3 billion. So you're probably looking, you know, $6 to $10 billion like that. So these are really big projects. Teesside, the number on that would be, I would guess, in the 20 to 30 billion range. Right, and so that also because that services a number of different emitter businesses on Teesside as a river in the UK. So ethanol plants, power plants, hydrogen plants. But to give you an example, question, yes.
That $21 billion Alberta project. How many different sources does it intend to get CO2 from?
Well, your luck here's the map. So, so oil sands Pathways Partners, including forget it, so they cover Cyberport, CNFL. So this is in there. So you're about 4 or 5 very large CO2 volumes in the world. The injection zone itself that features a 400 kilometer pipeline. Just to pause on that, maybe to answer your question. And as an example of what Pat's saying about Alberta being blessed with resources for injection, there frankly is very little about pathways that is highly repeatable in other parts of the world. In the sense that you don't often have that many huge emitter businesses with a commonality of emitter chemistry, blue stack, situated approximately to each other distance.
Get these.
Yeah, so I guess by contrast, the Northern Lights project, yeah, 16 billion euros, projects capturing CO2 molecules from, for example, ArcelorMittal steel plant in the UK. Then other steel plants located in the Benelux area. And so the idea is you've got these multiple sources, short pipelines delivering CO2 in supercritical state, which is then put on, they're then put on boats. And they're taken all the way to Norway to a terminal where it's unloaded and then injected.
They basically take, for example, the Heidelberg cement plant, which is southwest of Oslo. It's in a place called Brevik. Now, CO2 from that cement plant will be captured, compressed, and they've done an excellent job in engineering their. It will then be put on board the equivalent of LNG tankers called monos. Norwegian system. You can Google this, and it's very sophisticated. That's got to go all the way to Port disembarking station north of Bergen. Bergen is north of Stavanger. Then it's going to be stored there and then shifted to, should I say, piped 100 kilometers to this big field, which is operated by the whole process involves huge transportation logistics, but this is what the EU is committed to, and they are going gangbusters, especially in central North Sea. That will cost, is estimated per ton to be somewhere in the region of 180 US per ton. That's what it's going to cost, and that all has to be distributed. Somebody's got to work that out, but we'll get that. Just to give you an example of actually.
Yeah, oh, go ahead.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, 400 kilometers is short. And is there a reason why Coles Lake is better than Fort McMurray? Like, is there?
The answer to that is geologic answer. So,
Transportation varies tremendously. Two factors: distance, your throughput. If you've got really low throughput, a pipeline of 100 kilometers, you can have a huge range depending if your throughput is between 500,000 tons per year to 1.5. That cost will depend on your throughput, how much volume I can do through it. So if you're ready to develop, it's an easy question, it's a tough one to answer, because you'll not know definitively what your economics is going to look like until you have the right pipeline with the right capacity in place. It's not small chunk. I'm going for this, as I mentioned, it's what we call an industry. Even though there are different segments for ownership, their CO2 input should be accessible, collectible, collectible. You should come up with a solution. You know, these numbers are not there. You can see those the transparency requirement, and they are very different for this to be put out, which is by the way, a superb initiative that no other jurisdiction has. Canada has Alberta. It's a difficult decision, but a lot of it is also guided by the other variable, subsurface. What's got the optimum subsurface conditions or integrity, depth, crossing, permeability, or that capture? I'm sorry, it's a bit of a complex answer to a small question.
Yeah, so you could say, maybe a short answer to your question is 400 kilometers for enough volume is okay because it's economically scalable, but if you have low volume, 400 kilometers would kill you. That's not killing.
So, when you're transporting CO2 on ships, is it liquid or is it gas?
It would be in supercritical phase as well.
Yes. It's both. CO2 at supercritical behaves, it has the viscosity of gas, but the flow-like characteristics of the liquids. That's not a good answer. But it behaves very strangely. It's at a very strange point that you can compress it, because you can't really compress. If you compress the gas, you're going to use a lot of energy. So it's computation without the limit.
What's the temperature of supercritical?
Minus 14 6. So it's not.
So you have to refrigerate it.
You have to refrigerate it, but what it's not as bad as LNG. The large CO2 don't mean to be limited. If you have CO2 reservoir near the surface, which really don't want that, at a depth, should that Russia should be an emission. That CO2, what's it going to do? It's not harmful, it's not toxic, but it can, for example, if you have cows in the field that eventually, those cows are going to die. You know, their care, it does displace oxygen, they don't succeed. And those are the type of environmental issues that companies. That's LNG tanker. Peter found that that's the behind the bonds. So CO2 is far more manageable in terms of scale, and to the credit of the Norwegian Mobile Association, they have scales to transport by sea, and these therefore are now being fabricated in Korea.
What's interesting too is that ship, and it's cheaper than other forms of transportation. But we're going to get back to this. I mean, you look at something that's the scale of the plants at 60 billion euro, and you ask yourself if you're the steel plant paying a toll for the removal of that CO2. Well, how much does it cost to build a new steel plant in an injection zone? $1 billion. So we're going to get to that. There can be some tail banging around this stuff, and it gets its areas of view all day. So that's pathways. We've indirectly commented on this, but obviously bigger projects have challenges. The chief challenge is, well, it's really expensive. Very high capex. 5 billion, I would say they tend to be around 20 billion, 15 billion. It's fairly rare that you can see one of the sticker at 5 billion level. So obviously longer vessel or pipeline transportation distance is part of the cost factor. High OPEX. As Pat mentioned, you've got to compress this CO2 to get it into supercritical phase. That means you have to apply energy in the form of compressor. And if there's two ways to do that. It's either gas-fired or power-based compression. That's really expensive and kind of powerful. And so we're going to get into that being one of the commercial issues in CCS that really didn't get talked about much at all, but it's a huge issue. The big thing with mega projects is they're sustainable really only by government grant. So why has Norway rolled out this giant vision for like lights? Well, you got to be paying for it.
Just realized US was CO2 compression. So, the 6 CO2 only about 30 degrees C, 7.
By the way, it's possible. Yeah. Just the benefit of having a president. So, I think sustainable only by government grants is an important, a key thing to recognize.
Definitely, but definitely regarding the power for compression, is the implication that the power used for compression needs to be green power, renewable power, otherwise your emissions.
Let's start with that. I think the short answer is that renewables with their delivery system are not ideal at all for compression. Absent the creation of flammable storage, it really has to be either gas fired or So here's the thing, if you're collecting CO2 for an industrial emitter, and that emitter happens to be producing power, then you can capture those molecules as well. So you're capturing, if you think of it this way, and we'll get to this on emitter first, if the emitter first project is servicing primarily a power plant, let's say gas fired, well, you're already capturing all the CO2 molecules. So the CCS operator can do a bit of a right pocket, left pocket. But okay, look, we're going to take your CO2 molecules, you're going to give us power at cost. And why would they give it a cost? Well, because if it's not a cost, that just goes back into the folder thing. Right? So it's about taking cost out of the system, not adding cost into the system. But I'm not aware of renewables being proposed for compression.
Subsurface. I don't have the perfect answer to that question. You're using renewable energy from hydroelectric.
Well, there's been renewable at point with that. Site C down to BC.
Countries that can make construction materials and steel are more into spending billions of dollars for the environment. And is there any solution to see to keep the construction costs? You see,
It's like,
more.
yeah. As a personal comment, I share your exactly, by the way. We'll get back to that with the predictive analytics section, but I think you're right. But in short answer, let me give you an example. A country like Greece is not generally well suited for CCS capability. So if you had a steel manufacturer, Greece, so what are they going to do? Well, they could buy credits. But if you have a 40-year cement plant, you'd be able to say how much credits are not applied. In the sense that if you're investing in 40 cement plant, obviously you want to see through the certainty through that 4-year period that the carbon management process is going to escalate out of control. But what happens if it does escalate out of control? What happens to the cost of cement? So the housing question, I mean, it's a real concern. And because not all locations are treated equal, I think we'll get to the predictive analytics section, but you will see that it will be cheaper to live in some places than others, I think, in 35 years. And that's not going to make everybody happy. So, yes.
This is a technical question. Okay, let's say we have a constitution of, like, let's say it's a river industrial. This is like how will the operation or like capture having an EV plants, let's say there are 3,000 plants or 40,000. So are you using compression like field conversion due to chemical plants and capture and then put it in a pipeline, or is it how at least like how are you tracking the motion?
That's not an easy answer. That would be looking at our project. That is truly where a segment of this market is. It's doable, successful projects, small volumes. I didn't show you a fact here, but in terms of cost, the most difficult to upgrade cost or low concentrations, and generally, the type one, I think is sort of your question. You have the low concentration industries, which are difficult or fruit. Actually, the technology is not there. What I would predict, or what we believe will simply group, is that you are, in terms of this again, it's chemical engineering. Amines version 1.0 will have to go to amine version 3.5 in 10 years' time for that to be extracted economically. The problem is there's so many things going against you in these small disparate heterogeneous industries, is that their output is really nasty and variable. And for the chemical engineer to unify that type of solution that are cost effective today, we can't do that. So it's a negative thing. You can't keep your head in the sand. You can't keep your head in the Alberta reservoir. There is a future because there are institutions like this where research is being done. You can integrate. This is what it is that we develop this. There are college institutions as well. But if it's not about the moment, we should explore it.
Actually, we probably should have started with this comment, but there are, I'd say, despite the aspiration to cut down, there are very few tools at the ready right now that are capable. And so, for example, could power take over for oil and gas? Yeah, sure, at some point, but then the issue is storage. So renewables don't really look to scale without storage. Is, wall of batteries really the solution if you don't have enough rare earth minerals to create enough batteries? Like, that's really what the push is. So we view CCS, frankly, as a super critical tool in the next, I would say, 20 to 40 years that buys the time and space for storage technology to also come up the curve to be a serviceable solution. And getting back to the cost of living question, I mean, anytime you're monkeying with energy, you are monkeying with livelihoods. And so if you get anything about that calculus, if you get that calculus wrong, I hope not to have to decide between free education and free healthcare someday. But I do see scenarios where that could be cases where I'm careful. So going through challenges, well, look, anytime you're building $25 billion worth of stuff, there's obviously a high schedule risk and a cost overrun risk. The two being correlated. So why does that matter exactly? Well, I'll give you an example. Tabasco Steel in Ontario spent 1.7 billion retrofitting their steel plant with the new electric furnace that has the capability to capture carbon. So if they were to look for CO2 sequestration services, but an off-taker wasn't ready by 2030, how much excess carbon are you paying while you wait for the pipeline operator to show up? So this is part of the disadvantage of being in as part of the mega project, which is like, are you the priority and do people show up on time? And if they don't show up on time, well, you're probably paying for that, both in terms of the capex you put into expensive capture technology that now isn't doing anything yet, and excess carbon tax payments you're getting every year. So the correlation of government grants is obviously, it's not project financeable. Mega projects, I mean, it requires the government to put the money in. So Northern Lights, Norway pathways will be some combination of Alberta and the feds. These are not repeatable, financeable projects that the likes of which you see, for example, in LNG, where there is project finance. And so we also, because of that, with the economic viability of these things, it's another way of saying the same thing, that if you need government grants, it's because there's not enough market certainty to the business plan to make money. So there can be arguments for a state to take on things that are not economic if they're helpful and important to the populace. But just to be clear, this is not necessarily a money maker. So you have a question?
It's not clear to me that the fast they went electric cars. Why do they need CO2 capture?
Because part of their process still does emit CO2.
Or it's just a smaller amount?
Yeah, the volume is small. Yeah, the likelihood, the fact is when you're doing industrial stuff, the likelihood of emitting some carbon, even if you're on hours, is usually pretty high. So. Yeah.
I'm sorry to stop with your question. I don't think it's a good question. I probably haven't wrote it on question. Lithium is that organizable with carbon capture? Mutually exclusive technology.
On that, to give the horror show answer to that one, I can give you the second one.
Well, one's an input, the other's an output. So.
I think it's the same gas well. What about
I don't get it the same. Just a statement to pipeline. Lithium extraction. This lithium you obtain from the groundwater produced by oil and gas industry. You can get it from mining spodumene in Australia. You can get it from Brazil, Bolivia, Salinas area, where there's been eons of concentration of sulfur. Either reservoirs or other reservoirs. Lithium concentration, that's critical. CO2 is all about putting that in, and CO2 is highly corrosive. The negative side is that steel generally needs special grade steel to prevent. So, there's nothing worse CO2 happening in the gas industry. CO2, I think so. CO2 is top of the list. The blades, fan blades, it's all straight line and metallurgy to therefore pumps to deal with that under something quite separate, because really very little overlap in the two. Although, you've got me thinking now.
I'm asking because there's this big critical mineral conversation going on in. So I'm just asking, could you recover the from the oil wells and use the oil wells?
You typically see it more brine production, water production. We do have a plant that has nanotechnologies that actually can remove lithium from oil. And the problem is, oil comes up to nanotechnologies, and so it's much easier, more cost efficient to remove it from water base. One place there is a weird connection though, and we are looking at taking advantage of this, but if you were interested in brine water disposal, which is an industrial opportunity as well, you know, if that was your business and you wanted to know if you could do it in a given area, you're actually looking at very similar geology to do that. And so if you drill an evaluation well for a brine disposal purpose, you actually get kind of double your money, because that will give you an indication of how well that subsurface resource will work for CO2.
So this is the reason for my question. I'm wondering if this is where you're funding, maybe you can or because lithium is such a critical mineral, and Alberta has so much gas. I think, kind of, from what I see, I specialize. What I see in critical minerals, Alberta has more than in the residues. I'm not sure what it is. Doesn't that, and you mentioned cadmium being another information, I don't know whether it's extracted or this.
Oh, that's a fluid, yes.
Just
Maybe I was talking about coal-fired power stations, emergence.
But you can produce other rare minerals from brine water as well.
So, piggyback on the extraction of critical minerals and then use those same products.
I don't think they would be in the same project, but as we're going to get to with this model, another way to look at this is just scaling down CCS so that it actually makes sense, right? So maybe I'll again for you want to do this one. Really small. So in our comments, we've got things like, by the way, it's fairly common on most. They don't always like each other. Sometimes they're competing, you know, so just to say I'm going to collect all the CO2 from these people, well, if they don't like each other, you can imagine, hey, I get on the system first, right? Because I can lower the cost of my product if I have a lower carbon management cost. Can you freeze the other guy out who has greater access to capacity for injection, et cetera? So, you know, we started, this happened very early on for us. We were involved in a project that a municipal district in Alberta is looking at, where it had an industrial cluster that was being built as a greenfield operation. So imagine very large ammonia plants next to a very large ethanol plant all in one area. And the subsurface injection resource was what? 12. So we, as I like to joke, I pretty down it. Yeah. Start to realize, wait a minute, if you had an emitter business, sequestration, basically around, I mean, the name of this game is the lowest cost level for carbon management. You know, if you can inject, if you can get rid of your carbon problem for $70 or $40 or $80 and not 210 or 180, you have a massive competitive advantage. So as we started working on that project, we quickly realized that scaling it down did a number of things. the main bit of which was to create a repeatable model. So if you scale it down and have a level of cooperation between emitters, an injection company or CCS operator, and IPPs, that's independent power producer. Again, what's the IPP? Why do we worry about them? We have to meet the construction load requirements, right? So we recognized pretty quickly that this would be the repeatable model. So in the sense that pathways, I said, there's nothing inherently repeatable about pathways, in that you would need 6 or 9 with a kind of similar business to be located within a catchment that wasn't too far away from injection resource. Well, that's not going to happen in both places, right? So the emitter first model is what we call a CCS project. That is the analogy we use as shopping. I want to build a shopping mall. So if I can convince the bay to come to my shopping mall to be the anchor tenant, I can build a shopping mall around the bay. And then for every additional store, although shoe store, you know, that and beyond, for every additional business that comes in, that lowers the base occupancy. But because if you have one large emitter to start, you've got enough economic certainty to make the things begin. And so that's what we call emitter first. So the key elements are, that's at location, location, location. So proximity between emitters and injection points. This gets to a very interesting observation that we'll pick up in the analytics section. Yet if you have a historic business, a historic power plant, and it's got a 20-year life, you're not going to move that power line, right? But if you have a 35-year coal plant, well, that's a dirty emission source. Does it really make sense to pay all the money to capture carbon? Or does it make sense to shutter that plant, open a new gas-fired power plant, where the siting of the power plant is directly above an injection resource? No pipelines, or minimal pipelines. So if you think about, that's like building a shopping mall around the bay, and then if that, let's take the example of a power plant sitting on top of an injection resource. If there are other emitters within 5 or 10 kilometers, you can then build short pipelines to them to service them, but at a far reduced cost. So instead of allowing the price pressure screw to spiral out of control, you know, 15 billion, 20 billion, what would happen if you turned the other way? And so what we were starting to find is, by comparison to CapEx level, I mean, some of these projects are like 150 million, not 24 billion. What happens when you shrink it to 150 billion? Well, you're going to have less operating costs. You don't have this giant infrastructure there. Obviously, you're going to have less schedule risk. You're not a huge thing that takes years to build. So the schedule risk is less. The cost overrun risk always exists, but at least it's, you know, 10% on 150 billion is a lot better than 10% on 24 billion. So coming back to the last point, it's ideal for greenfield development, which is to say retrofitting an existing power plant or ethanol plant. Capture technology is pretty expensive. But if you're in the business of building brand new anyway, there is definitely cost savings to just engineering all that at one time. So this is the theory that as the repeatable thing. And so there are, that's where our attention tends to hang. Those we've been saying, some emitter first examples we've already covered. Yeah, we were servicing. If the bay or the power plant or if the bay was an ethanol plant. So this is a picture of a biofuels plant in Illinois, for example. Very small. The other thing is, if all of this, if CCS is kind of a new industry, I mean, as your grandmother would say, the KISS rule, keep it simple, stupid. There is an argument for not charging ahead with a $24 billion project instead of starting with a smaller experiment and building up. It just is less risky for capital. So, as Pat will tell you, is 20 kilometers, I mean, we say that's sort of ideal. Yeah, so if it's 20 kilometers, not 400 kilometers, you can see in the example we said, well, if you had a smaller volume, 400 kilometers would kill you, right? But if you have a smaller volume, well, 4 kilometers might not kill you, right?
If you're really happy. If you're only managing a couple 100,000, but it's there. Very simple.
So I guess we've been summarizing this as we've gone along, but what are the benefits of an emitter versus the KISS rule? Start small, build it up. Reduce capex, so that's 10 or 20 times less. Soon as it's 10 to 20 times less, there may be a lot more appetite for regular project financing. We're going to get to this in a minute, but particularly if you're doing an emitter first project in states under IRA where the feds are going to pay you $85 a ton, that's already enough liquidity in the system that a project developer may not even have to raise equity for the project. You've already got basically sovereign wealth signing on for $85 a ton, right? So that what I understand is your equity contribution, or you might have to raise a little bit. The rest you can go to the bank and say, well, listen, I built this mall and I built it around the bay, and the bay's got a huge business and they're creditworthy, so you should lend me the money to finance the rest on a debt basis, and then we'll kind of work it out on finding balance. So as we've also covered, well, the smaller the project, less risky it is to build, less likely it's going to be late, easier it is to manage cost overruns. If you're not late, well, then you're not paying excess carbon tax for every year that someone's not ready to take your CO2. We do also find it's sort of easier to balance the injection needs of a smaller emitter base. When you do start out with the bay, as we said in our model, if you start out with the bay and you get all those shoes and sport check comes along, that reduces the rent, say, payable by the bay. Because one emitter step forward to take a capital risk. You could say, well, because you took the capital risk, you get the primary benefit. Everybody's sort of more along for the ride, but that ride gets cheaper because the bigger player is for risk for everybody. And again, it's repeatable. So anywhere where you have an injection resource, this is the tempo approach. So it's a very different view of the world than, I mean, if I were to be a little bit critical of CCS mega projects in Alberta, I would say, there may be large pipeline companies that have lost the pipeline business in oil and gas, and they're just looking to replace it with another pipeline business. And there are visions of carboning Alberta in CO2 pipelines, but is that economically, does that make any sense? Just because that's the business you're in doesn't mean, if I'm in the business of selling hats, it doesn't mean everybody wants hats for me necessarily. It makes sense.
So he, that eventually, for all the future of people, to make more sense to kind of look at the government and kind of look for development in those geographies that will data point.
Because they say, look at the longevity of your plant. These are the whole decarbonization has caused a lot of existential questions to be asked. You're not trying to be philosophical. It's really about what it is. We responded to a Middle Eastern company because they had seen that the EU policy on which we have done carbon-rich products in the European market. So we're going to put, basically, it's going to be a tax, which is going to mean, even though the regulations are the January 26th. So these kind of actions globally, as we see the EU the only one to pop up. All that very tight. Some people say, let's go to Europe. Or even better, where would you go? I'd go to the States. I'd go down to anywhere in the States and pick up my 45 Qs. Well, 45 Qs are an amendment to the tax code, which allows you to get cash for your carbon emissions. $85 inflated, for the inflation was 2%. So in 15, 20 years' time, you pay me $120 per ton here. It's total sense. So the your facilities versus the net present value of those facilities versus facility. You go to many states, you're going to get additional investment tax credits. So this is causing a lot of disruption in the market. You know, we're all looking down and collected. It's looking spear and chaos.
Yeah, and to give you an example, if you were to build a power plant, normally you'd be like, well, I need water, I want to be near a 180 volt transmission line. Well, now there's another criteria potentially, which is where's subsurface injection. And if I can't find that, does it make sense for me to build 40-year power plants? And that I'm going to take care of the carbon problem purely by purchasing credits without any knowledge of what a credit is going to cost in 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. Like, you know, again, so credits are not a plan. So you've got another siting requirement, which is going to be actually super critical. Otherwise, these are summer students.
Yeah,
I did. Good to see you. Yeah.
Well, in order for systemic being more replicable than big mega projects, still requires good injection sites. So what's the viability of creating artificial injection sites, and is it possibly going to be more viable in the future, if not now?
Artificial.
Same thing about the inside. Each voice here, there is a cost associated with what you need. It's a cost and an environmental issue like disposing of these types of soil contaminants in the field. The use of cement. A lot of cement manufacturers are becoming very innovative, using CO2 and incorporating it within the cement. It's a reservoir. I mean, it's actually a block. It's not safe. So I think they should probably find an indirect aspect to find it through.
Yeah, I think another way of putting your question mark is that that's a huge, there's other injection type, but there's use. So coming back to, you know, we don't have large scale technologies. take care of this problem, no matter what the politician says, it just doesn't exist yet. But I could see, people will develop good technology, good graphene products made from CO2 emissions for plate plastics. Sure. They just weren't up there now. So back to what's that, in our view, the critical bit of CCS is that it allows basically other technologies to come up the curve. The point of action. Their economic.
And just following on your comments about the idea of artificial science. And you may not have the answer, but is it possible that we could use abandoned wells that we have now? That's so big. It's like for hydrogen. Would that all be possible? And the idea you already have some infrastructure there to do?
That's a question. Let me just take that out. Take that out.
I didn't mean to go there.
Structure subsurface. We want to have a surface that is intact, virtually nothing has perforated on the surface. No, so, CO2 capture directly underneath all the produced fields. Technical analysis. The problem with CO2, as I mentioned earlier, it's massively corrosive.
Yes, exactly.
That's the problem. You need totally new metallurgy. You go to an industry, you look at very complex CO2. 99% CO2 going down the lines. No water, please. No water. It'll be totally dehydrated. That's the real challenge to use.
And I don't know how it's the same. As I like to joke, everyone remember Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin went out and covered.
Gentlemen, it's now 11:25. Should we not take just a 5-minute break? Sure. Grab coffee. Just
We did some really funny so what I might do is kind of tear through some of this so that, because I do want to hold some time for predictions. The analytic part of this again, so what world did we possibly accidentally created for ourselves? Well, that might be another way to say, what world did some small group of people purposely create for ourselves and then the rest of us? So, but in terms of legal and commercial issues, this is the law school. It's useful to go through Alberta, a bit of the background on Alberta legislation. But as some of you may know, 2010, the Crown reported to expropriate forest space in this province. I have some personal opinions about this and some professional opinions about it. I would say, you know, in the early days, think back to law school, giant terror theory, you own from the earth all the way to the heavens. So the idea that the state would come in and take away space is kind of weird. So to give you an example, if I own a building in downtown Calgary, it comes with a height allotment, and I can sell that height allotment to someone else if they're going to build their building 5 stories taller. Imagine if the city or the Crown came in and said, well, actually, we're taking away all your height allotments. Being internationalists, I mean, what's shocking about this is when you do work in other countries, your sole source of paranoia is having your assets ripped off by a foreign government all the time. And yet this happened in 2010 and nobody said anything. It's super weird. Anyway, but 2010, the expropriation of pore space occurs. This is clearly in line with some so those two things are not accidental. And then you have a series of other pieces of legislation. The Geothermal Resource Development Act, you had in January 2021, DAR froze certain P&G rights to make a reservation in the Elk Point group now for this. So that was interesting and frankly kind of remember I said we came across this as a helium problem. We had a helium operator that wanted to post the lines in the Elk Point and was suddenly told that he couldn't do so. But why? He said, well, they're reserved. Like, they're for who? Oh, the Crown reserved them for CCS. So there have been a number of developments that have been not necessarily well publicized. So proceeding through there, you then had notice of intention issue the first CCS hub tender. So that was the for the hubs in and around the Edmonton area there. And that was followed by actually a second one. So, I mean, to make a long story short, we've had this pattern of legislative amendment or government regulatory action that's been building us in the direction of CCS, one way or another. It's important to keep that background in mind as we look at questions like subsurface competition. So, toward the beginning of this lecture, I said, in our minds, we're starting to think of subsurface more as just a place where inputs and outputs happen for different industries. So historically, say 30 years ago, all you were really worried about was oil and gas production and maybe water. Well, look at the proliferation of things now. You've got P&G production, as it's called, EOR, but you also have carbon injection, you have brine water production for lithium extraction, you've got wastewater disposal. You have brine water production for its own right, because people need brine for fracking, for example. Helium production, and then agriculture of water. So the pore space is becoming a pretty crowded area, and it's not single industry focused anymore. And so what happens when you have different industries coming in? Well, they all have different drivers, different economics, different interests. And you always then get the possibility that these different industries start competing with each other to use the subsurface. And so this is in fact what's so the map on the right shows you, I'm colorblind, by the way, so I gotta call it green, and everyone's gonna tell me it's like pink or something. You can see where the large swath of injectable CO2 zones are. The dotted line indicates the depth below which CO2 is supercritical and going against this. What we're talking about, these are the areas where you want to be injecting. If you look around Edmonton, you'll see that the Shell West CCS reservation sits to the northeast of Edmonton. Bizarrely enough, most of it sits outside that supercritical bottom line. But when Shell West was awarded the right to do this experiment, the Crown gave them 70 townships of land. Kind of crazy. It's like saying, knock yourself out of that. You don't care where the CO2 goes. Just get it in there. So, But where this gets really interesting, if you see these colors, so that would be sort of in and around the Grand Prairie region. On both maps, you can see the distribution of lithium permits, for example. So that's a flat. And the presence of lithium. So you start to get a view where this competition starts occurring, which is like, well, wait a minute. Good areas for CCS also happen to be decent areas for lithium. We explain to you. So what would happen if a certain brine, a certain, basal Cambrian sand, once you start injecting CO2, you're obviously potentially affecting what somebody may be able to get out of the same zone. And so you have the battle of unintended consequences. So for helium producers, for example, this was a particular concern because if a CCS operator were permitted to just inject CO2 into a random aquifer, to Pat's point, if you don't have a closure, well, you don't actually understand fully where that CO2 is going, and is it just going on land for other purposes? And are those lands that people already paid for through a crown permit or a crown lease? So this is frankly going to get worse every year, and we're going to discuss the impact of that. But coming back to the map on the right, you see this triangular figure that runs along the Saskatchewan border with, here. I mean, that's a big area. So when our helium client went to coastal lands around here, he said, sorry, it was reserved. I mean, it's not like a little part of the province was reserved. It's a huge area of the province that there was really nothing else to it. So bigger Cold Lake is, by the way. You start to wonder whether that observation was made for the benefit of pathways and what discussions may or may not. Get a coordination. Competition legal. Well, I think it comes in two forms: the battle of tenure rights and the battle of uses. So as it stands right now, just to pick a crown example, you can go get a petroleum application. You can get a CCS evaluation permit. After a CCS evaluation permit, if you prove up your CCS project, you are supposed to be given a CCS lease. So also gives out minimum permits, things like lithium. There are requirements, there's plenty of other permits. Each one of these is essentially some kind of granting document for the state. The problem is the law doesn't tell you who prevails in what circumstance. So should a permit be a lease? What happens if you have two leases squaring off against each other? What's the priorities between them? So all this is after, but it does, as most disasters do, open the strategies for what we call them from. So, example, let's say someone wants to do helium extraction. It was for a while unclear whether helium even came with a petroleum and natural gas lease or whether you needed another tenure right for it. But you could then potentially go get permit A over an area covered by lease B, and then the result of that is if a natural gas producer was producing helium, that producer might not have. It will issue minimal permits with helium while also issuing B&G leases with helium. So for a while for helium, there were two branding instruments. They quickly figured out the disaster, the lawsuit disaster that they do problems, there's no coordination for this. So what you hear a lot is a focus from AER instead on permitted use. This is a subtlety. So let's say I want to do CCS. They give a reservoir, but somebody's already injecting wastewater into that reservoir. Under directives 56 and 65, I will have to make an application to the AER. And one of the criteria for those applications is I have to show that I'm not, So what's interesting about that is by focusing on the use question under regulation, the AER sort of like sidestep the tenure problem, right? Because they're regulating this by question of use, not by question of granting document. And I think they're different things. Obviously, use is an important consideration, but they're not identical. And so you do get this sort of interesting overlap, which is, well, if I paid for a mineral permit, for example, the extraction, and somebody makes an AER application for CCS in the same area that my lithium permit happens. And let's say the AER says, okay, knock yourself out, go ahead. But that CCS has a negative impact on my ability to produce lithium. Well, I paid for that. So it is a problem to CCS. So we see these things coming in droves. In fact, our joke in the office will not let you. But, you know, we think the litigation bar of 2026, 2027 is going to be overrun with lawsuits for something that we call subsurface trespass, which is, well, that's another way of saying, well, wait a minute, what are you doing here wrecking my business? And if the AR doesn't do this carefully, you can see how the Crown might then get drugged into these questions, which is like, well, effectively, you took my money for a mineral permit, I can't use it. So you expropriated. All right, you should pay me, right? So, you know, part of this too is like, well, because there are no coordinated rules around tenure rights or even uses, I have not seen, to my knowledge anyway, a set of rules around, well, what does trump if you're weighing two uses? Is it just, well, look, I've been here longer injecting wastewater. So should it be, is it whoever their first wins? Because I've been doing this already for 10 years. I can see the province saying, well, listen, you know, I make $10 of tax revenue on waste injection, whereas if I allow Pat to do CCS, I'm going to make $250. You know what they say about legislation, you don't want to see how the sausage gets made, but like these are the things that are going to cause trouble. And we haven't, we know that trouble's coming, it hasn't quite fully completed yet. I'm not going to delve into the first one in great detail, but I do have some doubts as to whether the 2010 expropriation is done properly. The laws around expropriation, sure, the government has eminent domain, but there are elements of the law that require notice and fairness and all those things. You can't just take people's stuff away. So you could imagine on the more safe space of expropriation, you have an entire province full of people who have already paid the groundwork for capacities. You have, in some cases, freehold landowners who own mineral pay. And then you have Crown comes and says, well, I'm going to take this away with minimal notice and I'm not going to pay. And I will guarantee you that's the honor of us. So this one gets interesting. We also do work with Ontario, we did happen to see Enbridge pushing the Ontario government to follow the Alberta law and create based all of Southern Ontario. You know, put these things in perspective, that would be like the largest expropriation that's ever been heard in the Ontario against the politically thrown out of this model. Ontario, owners do get like have some multi-government. The other thing about expropriations, which internationalists like Pat Ryan well, there's a lot of treaties that say you can't steal people's stuff and not pay for it. So those are bilateral benefit treaties. That is the replacement to NAFTA, which I can never remember the acronym for.
USMCA, for whatever reason, should have just been NAFTA too.
NAFTA 2, I call it NAFTA. We now have a trade agreement with Europe. So if the state were to expropriate an asset, and I know the 12 are living in Kazakhstan, and that the company that was the target of the expropriation happens to have a shareholder from Germany and another one from the US, you will potentially see claims. Here's the funny part. Under those treaties, guess who has to pay for the claims and defense them? The federal government. So you can just see the mess, the legal mess. I mean, it's great for litigators who like endless sources of work, but it's not great for projects because what you're talking about is foreseeability, repeatability, and all these are risk elements that need to offer. We talked about subsurface. That has paid, so that's the old, hey, what are you doing here moment. And so to give you an example, I was just talking to John back there about freehold. If the Crown allows the CCS operator to inject CO2, I don't know, within 2 kilometers of the boundary with a freehold owner, and that CO2 is going in the ground and moving over.
Yeah.
Right? Now the Crown's going to say, well, I expropriated the pore space, so that CO2 is only moving around the pore space. What is the functional difference between a space in the ground and someone's ability to economically produce from that other property? Like, I'm going to argue they're not all that different a thing. And so I think there's an artificiality about pore space expropriation. Obviously, huge impact on project financing. You go against, if you had a whole bunch of money, would you invest in a company that was at a subsurface pass claim and an expropriation claim? No one's going to fund that on a project finance basis. But if that company is listed on the TSX, no one's going to underwrite those shares either. So you do have these like secondary, like big impacts that could pop up on it. So as we pointed out already, functionally none of the mega projects receive project finance. It's all the government grants. So we have no idea what the project finance pattern will be. Like it literally needs to be invented. One aspiration pattern I have is to invent it and then charge people a lot of money to repeat it. We're working on that. That's everything we said. They just wasn't easily said using a metaphorical format. But a moment here about and Canada's ITC, so that's income tax credits for carbon projects, really compete with IRA. I mean, I think the very obvious answer, both for us and for PMO, that CCS. You have to stop your government, pay you 85. That is a much greater benefit than tax credit. Number one, number two, the tax credits expire September.
They don't pay, they don't.
They're just less effective in a window that's. we'll get into the predictive analytics of that, but like Canada right now is not. States are really we've already sort of beat this to death, but power load, pretty critical. So if you buy an electron off the grid, that will cost 30 to 40% more than the electron you generate on your own land for yourself. Why? Because when you buy it off the grid, you're paying for the transmission, provider costs, all these other costs. So as Pat mentioned, the power load is the biggest single operating expense for CCS in any given year. So if you can get rid of 40% of your operating costs every year, that's what you do. Which means functionally that every CCS project is actually a hidden power project, if you want to get it right. So that's very poorly understood. To big utility in this province or any other province or state is not going to love the idea that everybody's going to generate their own power in their own backyard and not by grids, electrons off the grids. There's a political battle. I mean, this, in Alberta, we do have 2 regulatory designations. ISD is an industrial system designation. The other one, which is brand new, the law has been approved, but it's not been proclaimed yet. It's called self-supply. So these will be the 2 chief weapons in Alberta used for CCS to keep that power cost down. And because not every province or state has the same approach to power, like for example, SAS Power has a monopoly, BC Hydro has a monopoly, so that they don't have these tools in their toolbox the way Alberta does. Whereas if you go to Michigan, there's more laxity, et cetera. So, yeah, will it be worked by big utility? They're already whinging about it. It's not much we love big utility. Okay, so I know we have 2 minutes here. But we can go over for Q&A. But this was the really interesting part of this. You know, what are the real factors with carbon? So when we started this journey out, Pat and I were talking to people like, yeah, okay, well, I just want to avoid 170 tons. The more we thought about it, we thought, no, you are. That's a very simplistic view of the world. For example, if I make GMC trucks and I can have a CCS facility right next to my factory that sends all the carbon straight into the ground for $70 a ton. So I'm making $15 cash off IRA. This is an invention as a scenario. That means a GMC truck could be, I can price it way more cheaply than a Toyota created in Alabama that doesn't have a CCS facility. So what starts off as companies just thinking about, oh, I just want to avoid one cost with another lower cost, actually becomes a question of who has the lowest carbon management cost and what does that mean for my market penetration? Which is to say, it becomes existential. So for companies out there, they're like, I'd rather just ignore this. Well, if you ignore it and Pat doesn't ignore it and he really gets it right, you're going to be in big trouble, right? So that's one factor. The other factor is, well, you know, for a lot of commodities, steel, aluminum, bauxite, etc., where the highest value markets often are Europe and North America. So as Pat explained, if CBAM essentially puts a tax on any non-European heavy carbon commodities, let's say that tax is 30%. If you are producing steel and you don't have a solution to this problem, you're still going to be 30% more than your competitor. So if the premier market, if one of them is the EU, and you've just lost all your market share in the EU, that means you've ceded your market potential to somebody else who got this problem sorted first. So it is an existential issue. So this is regional carbon import duties. And so where do you get, and I think this is where Pat and I find it super fascinating. You're like, wait a minute, are you guys negotiating WTO effectively? So when you look up Seaver Rules, as Pat did yesterday, it's like it blazoned at the top. No, we are certain that this complies with WTO. I think like the lady got protest too much when the first thing that comes out of their mouth. But so when you start looking at it from that perspective, is the real purpose of the IRA in the States, for example, dealing with carbon, or is it about dismantling globalization and moving industrial capacity back to the States? Is that what America is paying $85 a ton for? Yes, I think so. So it should behoove Canadians to ponder that carefully, because if our ITCs are good enough, if I were running a steel plant in Ontario that's last life, but I put billions of dollars more into a site getting lukewarm tax credit, or would I just close my facility? So this is a predictive analytic. So earlier I said, for ArcelorMittal, how much does it cost to build a new steel plant? Let's say it's $2 billion. So let's say our prices are, it can continue producing steel at an old UK plant. And I'm just going to make up a zany example. Let's say Morocco comes to Arcelor and says, tell you what, you close your UK plant, you come here, we will give you the land, and we will ensure that that land is sitting on top of a CCS reservoir that we've already invested. And our country is already full of raw materials required to make steel. And we'll give you $1 billion credit. So a couple things. What is Northern Lights doing now? Did that expenditure of 16 billion Norway dollars make any sense? So this is going to when we talked to Panic, did talk to a Panic cement operator in Greece. They're like, okay, well, yes, but they capture. Well, here's the thing, you don't do anything unless you're going to pay for boats. Harbor and maybe take it to CCS facility in Bulgaria or somewhere where there is the ratio. These are hugely disruptive issues. And the more I look at this, the more I see with that the Americans are reshuffling the deck around the location of industrial capacity. So in a weird way, it's like make America great again. With a private investment. But I think movement with industrial this. We had another example. We were talking to somebody in the GCC country. But to give you an example, Dubai has an aluminum smelter. If aluminum from that smelter faced a 30% duty from CBOM, then that smelter loses its European markets. They probably don't sell a lot in North America anyway, because the transportation distance, I mean, their products are too expensive. So they either need to figure out CCS, buy credits, but credits aren't planned. So there will be, this is an important thing, are we moving into a regionalization of industrial capacity with industrial purpose or markets feeding those regions? So this is where you get back, is the purpose of this breakdown. But if we follow whether it's the Dubai example or the Aerostar example, well, what happens if those plants close? Well, you don't have jobs. The state would tax revenue all over Dubai that's been loaded. all the secondary service industries that service that plant are in code. So we're coming back to this gentleman's question about inflationary cost of housing. What happens to, well, if your aluminum plant closes, you don't have a local source. So now what, are you buying from the European? Right? Yeah. And I do have great worries actually that the inflationary question has not been thought out very well yet through this piece, and I do find it worrying. The other thing, of course, well, if you worked at a steel plant and you were a trained professional and now you don't have a job. So this is where, you know, this is where we think this may all be going. So that's a pretty long way off. Oh, I just want to avoid $170 a ton.
I mean, really touched.
Yeah, and this is sort of made disappointing. We're certainly behind the Americans as a country. I think it's less clear that we're behind Europeans. Like I think the US did.
But it's my understanding if you go to the US, Canada, those that have access to UK North Sea, which are exempt from. Down to Australia, China. We haven't talked about China yet. China, the gas, is one of the biggest CO2 producers. If they start capturing CO2, what's going to happen to the carbon markets? Huge issues. I mean, really thought out by governments, Finland, Alberta, Canada, US.
Well, the other hand, if Chinese manufacturers don't tackle the CO2 question, and they do face, for example, 25-30% tariff, sebum are those is shipped in the factory world. I mean, I don't know technically, but obviously there's a lot of and so to give you the problem, here's the example I worry about. Let's say the carbon plant is combine throughout the week, harvest the wheat, that's a combine, get the wheat off the field, and transport it by train. That's diesel, goes to a mill, right? Yeah, I guess meal, mill. So the mill turns it into flour, they get transported by gas vehicle to the bakery, who then puts the loaf of bread in a plastic bag, which is made with, you know, petroleum products. If you think about the cost of your bread is a reflection of all of those incremental cost elements through the supply chain added up. And so if your initial input is, let's say, $10, the gas, you look at 20-30, in theory, diesel should cost more. So let's say that's $13 or $14 plus a carbon element. And then you're duplicating a double increase every step. When you're talking about I do worry that, you know, this is the benefit of CCS work. So. Gas car, she can't afford a Tesla. It has a power bill of 1,500. So, like, these are the inflationary pressures I really do. Which is very dark. This is a sensible, repeatable thing. Because I think it's, I think, you know, the way in which you do it.
He's not great. Maybe you should.
That's your point. US was stable, paid 85. But that's pretty two-dimensional understanding. But okay, well, I might get a tax credit, so we'll find your doing. Business in the state chasing that $85. If you wonder how are the Americans going to pay for this, by the way, that it may be, do they onboard a bunch of industrial capacity, those businesses then pay tax, and they sort of like, you know, by creating a new taxpayer base, they work that.
Out of curiosity, what was the date when that $85?
For a reason. I mean, it's just going to explode in the market. That's the
Even for EOR, they do get $60.
I'm sharing the pensions because it really does. If you take all the environmentals, the green tide is another sector. Okay, Alberta, okay, government. You cannot use CO2 to give off. It's a great, that's a huge loss of opportunities. It's a great so much. Yes, it will produce hydrocarbons. So, you can use lubricants. That's what it's sounds easy. Anyway.
Yes, the thought around the EOR is still one. That's the objective. Do that. It's obviously less optimal because you're dead still producing oil, but we'll just work that out in the pricing. But we're going to keep on the pattern of dealing with the carbon. So for that, yeah, it was last year, but it was like a $100.
Well, we can carry on with questions after, but at this stage, it's 12:15, so perhaps we could show our appreciation to both Tony and Pat for, I think, a very informative and thought-provoking presentation. So that's the first. Ask everyone, please, to take a minute to complete the feedback form. I've already done so. Thirdly, I would carbon capture and storage. My colleague Nigel Banks is working on an A-blog article on that. Come out for A-blog. And again, I'd like to thank all of these experts for, I think, the tremendous insight they provided today, And I take it Joe might be around for a few minutes to answer questions that there are at this stage. Important topic.